We're going to be talking, for our first panel today, we're going to be talking about the Internet of Things, and not just securing the Internet of Things itself, but also the security problems that having everything connected brings up for your other existing systems. So IoT security really, I think, is one of the most interesting things we can talk about these days, because it covers the gambit of all security problems. So we've got a great lineup of guests here on the panel who really know their stuff in this area, and we're going to be breaking down all the major issues. So I'm going to come along this way, starting with Rob. If each of you could just kind of introduce yourselves very quickly, very briefly, and explain how IoT affects your mission at your agency, your businesses. Rob?
Sure, thanks. So Rob Powell with NASA. I'm the agency's senior advisor. In my role, I work very close with our mission directorates and trying to address complex problems where you have multiple offices within our agency that have a level of responsibility for things like IoT, right? It requires that these offices all pull together to solve the common needs of a mission. For example, if you take our aeronautics mission directorate, they're heavily involved with research of airflow over wings and fuel efficiencies within aviation. Wind tunnels are a big part of their mission. So if you think of a wind tunnel, you can imagine the industrial control systems that are part of wind tunnel capability. So that is an agency, mission critical capability that we have to ensure proper protections are in place for those ICS type of devices connected to the wind tunnels. That's just one example.
And it's an interesting example, too, because a lot of times these days we think IoT, we're thinking about toasters and refrigerators and the like. We're not thinking about ICS, and it's such a critical part of our systems. Sean.
Hi, I'm Sean Kelly. I'm the CISO of the Environmental Protection Agency. Like NASA, like Department of Energy, like a lot of others, even the medical community, we have a lot of research devices, which are all connected, and they're usually connected to a computer that probably Windows 98. There's even rumors of NT out there someplace.
Hey, don't bash NT.
Work within an environment, you will too. But, a research device lasts somewhere between 10 to 15 years. So if it's in the middle of its life right now, we still have quite a bit of life left on it, and the business customer is not going to be looking to replace that because of the enormous cost. And so we have to figure out how we keep those things secure. When they were created, they weren't really thinking about the world we live in today. And, what do we put them in an enclave? How do we protect them? How do we monitor them? And how do we make sure that they're not causing more issues? As well as the whole host of new Internet of Things that are coming out. We are addicted to the data that these things bring. I think, I remember when I was talking with a Cisco person probably 10 years ago, and they were starting to show me all the sensors they had in race cars going around the race car tracks and all the data they got. I hope I'm not stealing your thunder. I needed something. But I thought that was great. And then when you sit in a CIO or a CISO role and you realize with that data comes a great cost, it really does start to cause you some issues. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at and we're trying to figure out. But I think that all the CISO community will admit is we don't have enough funds to look at these type of problems. And we're shooting the wolves closest to the porch and trying to figure out what are the problems of today that I have to deal with. Internet of Things is something in the back of our mind that's worrying the heck out of us. But at the same time, we have a lot of things that we're worrying about every day.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Rob. So I'm Brian Tillett. I am with Cisco. I am Principal and Director in Cisco Security Advisory. And what my role is I'm really a catalyst between how we do things inside of Cisco and how to make those things successful inside of some of our other customers as well. So going right back to what Sean was saying here about IoT and the type of data you're gathering. So when I go talk to a major auto manufacturer and they're pulling in telemetry from their automobiles and bringing it into a data center to make cars emissions efficient or pass emission standards, things of that nature, I want to make sure that I am pulling in anonymized data and I'm not pulling in specifics around Rob or specifics around Sean and what time he was on the toll road. But at the same time, how do I monetize security? How can I make security put points on the board instead of just being a cost center? So when I talk to those large auto manufacturers about the telemetry they're pulling in, then how can I monetize that? Well, if I'm looking at the ambient air temperature and the humidity in a certain zip code, can I sell that back to corporate farmers? And now can I use IoT information and monetize it? And again, how does security contribute to a bottom line instead of being an inhibitor or a cost center or something that inhibits innovation? Now, in the public sector, that's a little different. So now I've got to talk about doing protection of private citizen data, protection of mission, and protection of the warfighter. One of the things I really enjoy doing is talking about how to use security as an enabler for an entire country. So if I brief the Vice President of Costa Rica on how to improve her cybersecurity borders, that's going to improve her chances of winning business if Dole wants to build a new pineapple plant in the region, because they can protect their intellectual property better in that country than they can in Panama or Ecuador. These are things we've never talked about in security and how to actually make security put points on the board, and that's the cool part of my job.
Excellent. And Stan?
Stan Black, I'm Chief Security Officer for Citrix, so within my general purview is safety of people, technology security or cybersecurity, and product security roadmap and strategy. You know, it's funny, when we talk about IoT, I'm a little jaded, but we have everything from logic controllers that are out there that have been used by the utility industry for decades, and then we have refrigerators and toasters. So from my viewpoint, I think we need to take a lot of our lessons learned from how we mitigate, control, and contain some of the risks associated with IoT, and recognize the fact that every time you think that it's only going to connect to this, that there's something about a month and a half away. So whether it's a cloud, whether it's your car, and as you talk, Citrix has about 400,000 customers worldwide, and during the course of any given day, about 200 million customers in every vertical you can imagine, including public sector, are all using our technology. How do we take that technology and mitigate a significant risk without adding yet another layer? You know, has anybody seen an IoT firewall yet? I haven't seen one yet. But so how do we leverage what we've already invested to get more out of our existing technology? That's where we're spending a lot of time right now.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. So we're going to, as I said when I opened up here, we're really going to hit IoT in 3 stages, and great openings because you guys all touched on at least 2 of them in each of your openings. I want to talk about the threat from IoT devices where an attacker can get onto a device and then move laterally onto your network. We have the issue of what we saw last year with the Mirai botnet, right, where it turned all of these IoT devices worldwide into zombies as part of that botnet and used that IoT infrastructure to leverage an attack. And then finally, data security, right? The whole point of IoT, the benefit of IoT is all that data that you can bring in to help you make decisions. Sean, like you were talking about EPA, that's what you guys do. How do you then protect that data when it's coming at you like a fire hose? So those are the 3 things we're going to break down and talk about. These guys are definitely going to have a discussion between themselves. I'm here to mostly just push things along and stay out of the way. But I'd love it if everybody out there joined the discussion as well. So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. I know we got mics floating around. If I'm paying attention to these guys and not you, and you've got a pressing question, just shout at me and we'll get you. So let's get this moving. To begin with, let's start talking about botnets and things like Mirai and how that can affect. Sean, with all of the IoT devices that you've got out there at EPA, you've got everything from sensors on smokestacks to down in the water measuring temperatures. You got stuff all over the place. How do you make sure all of those individual devices stay secure so that they can't be used together to leverage an attack?
Pray. It really does come down to that. I mean, a lot of these things, you know, were put out when EPA is a very federated model. And so there's a lot of things going on in the region, the program offices that have a lot of things out there. I was at a conference one day speaking. A gentleman was from New York City. He said, there's a box. It says EPA. And I just want to know what it does. I said, really, man, CIA? I have no idea. They just put our name on it. You know, at the end of the day, once something, you mentioned botnets. I can speak at EPA. We're still fighting the fight manually. It's about people fighting. The problem is when we start looking at botnets and you start looking at the attacks of today, most of them are automated. And once I allow the Internet of Things or any sensor or a research device on the network, it's just like an insider user. It's the biggest threat that I have inside the network. And once you're in, if someone sophisticated has not even that sophisticated, they can elevate their posture or their privileges within the network to do a lateral movement or even an upward movement to admin privileges. And so it is concerning, and I think that's what we try to do with educating our users to say, they're like, well, look, Sean, it's one sensor, it's one this, it's something that's going to drastically change the business that we do. I get it, I really do. But here's what, and you go through it, and I was in a leadership meeting the other day, and they said, security is recognized as the biggest disabler of our business. I said, with $5.2 million, I agree, because that's my annual budget. I said, when you increase that, or I could take a percentage of everybody's budget in this room, then we can have a better conversation about how we can enable the business, because that's really where we want to be. I don't think anyone in security nowadays wants to be the no person. We want to be someone who says, how do we enable this? How do we take a calculated risk that isn't so high that we know we're going to get burned? No one wants to be the next OPM.
Because that's really a business disabler.
No one wants to be in front of Congress. No one wants to have their reputation destroyed because they allowed something where they knew it was going to happen, and they bowed to the pressure. But again, at the other side of it, as we just talked about, we want to enable the mission. Not just on the commercial side, on the government side. We want to look at how do we do this, but do it securely.
Mm-hmm. Brian, when you're looking at this large attack surface, is it better to secure individual? If you had to focus, like Sean said, you only have so many resources. Should you focus on securing individual IoT instances or the network as a whole?
Well, so I'm going to have an interesting perspective on that because I work for the network company, but I'm going to back up on that. And one of the first things I'll say is you can't detect something abnormal unless you know what normal is in the first place. So if you look at how the intelligence community solved their data hoarding problem, they started embracing technologies like NetFlow and being able to say, all right, this is what typically should happen, and I want to make sure that anything outside of that now throws me an alert, and maybe in inhibitors or enforcement mechanisms, things of that nature. So I would say the first thing you need to do is identify what it is you're trying to protect. What's the worst possible scenario? And then write your policy on that. I've seen organizations that try and buy a silver bullet or buy a silver bullet technology without any policy on how they're going to deploy that type of thing. So I don't think there's any singular answer in there. I think if you're able to go in and understand, all right, I think it was a Pokémon Institute statistic that only 6% of IoT devices need to reach beyond their immediate next neighbor or outside of their immediate closest segment. So what is that 6% and how far do they need to reach, and how do I set delimiters on how far out they should go? And yeah, that's a network perspective. When you get into the other types of IoT devices, you might have Windows and NT on them, there might be headless devices. How do you protect that as a segment to make sure something abnormal doesn't go in and affect that and track that as well?
Did you want to jump in on that? It looked like you were.
So going back to the first part of your question, right, of how do you protect and maybe prevent botnets, what have you, lateral movement. I was going to put a comment out there. If you think of this in terms of the full complexity, it's kind of like trying to boil the ocean. I use that term a lot in our agency because we're also a federated operating model, so it makes it difficult. And so you have to step back and say, okay, what are our most critical assets or capabilities to our agency? Let's start there. Let's understand the architecture of the systems involved with that program. Let's understand who has access. What are the opportunities for lateral movement? Do you understand your layer 2, your layer 3 connected devices? And so we have a program where we do an in-depth analysis that is beyond just a regular pen test. Right, and we understand, what are all of the ingress and egress points for a given system? What are all the various data sources that are tying into the system? Who has access? That becomes critically important because then you can start identifying, why do I have this ICS with a networking component that allows through connectivity through the internet, but it's also connected to maybe a production server type of LAN segment. Mm-hmm. Those things all become critically important. And if you don't understand your architecture, going back to the network piece, you're never going to be able to put in that segmentation to ensure that your production servers are separated from your ICS type of components, from your end user machines, et cetera, et cetera.
And NASA, we were talking about before, you guys have finished up CDM phase 1. That was really about identifying all of those assets and that network mapping, correct? And now you're moving on to phase 2?
Yeah, so my comments there were really about the reading room, right? So prior to the rollout of CDM implementation, we had a reading room where we brought in our architectural information, our system information, what have you. And, when you go through that at a large agency, you realize, hey, we have some gaps here. We need to shore up our knowledge of that agency as a whole, architecture, if you will. So, we kind of learned through that process that we've got to get our arms around that complexity of the architecture, the connected devices, what have you. So we're doing a little bit of recovery from that first, that reading room instance, I guess you'd say, of making sure we do have the complete picture.
Right. Because, when we're talking government, everything comes down to acquisition and clarity, right? The clearer you can be upfront about what you need, it's going to save you so much headache down the road. You also, nice transition, because you start talking about the lateral movement, that IoT, that threat vector as well. Stan, Brian was talking about before, a lot of these devices, they don't need to talk to everything on the network. Some of them just need to have a short range. And a lot of these devices, they're smarter than the wood, but they're pretty dumb when you compare them to other things. How much of a threat is lateral movement from an IoT device?
Without any planning, it's a huge threat. We've heard segmentation so far. You can't protect something if it's not known. So, regardless of the technology that you have in your corporation, I've also heard federation twice, or you're a fully federated organization. When you think of it from what is this device designed to do? It's only internal and it should never talk externally. That's you can stop that, and you don't need some new type of technology to achieve that objective. Also, what does any single device do during the course of its life cycle? You can analyze that. It's a threshold. You know that it should only be pushing on a certain port, on a certain protocol, the certain number of things that it does a day. And then the next big major assumption you should have is once it's been released to the wild and it's out in your infrastructure, it may never see the light of day for support, patch, etc. So contain, control, and mitigate are simple words, but ultimately, if we reduce the ability for something to do something it's not designed to do, and I've seen this done everything from spreadsheets to machine learning, and I have a mix of almost every single one of those. If we are able to understand what lateral motion is, what normal is and should be, we can take that off of our radar, and then we can manage what the delta is, and that's a reasonable and manageable attack surface and a series of vectors that I think that we have a chance to solve.
Mm-hmm. And that's really applying some classic InfoSec.
Nothing fancy.
Yeah, right, just on this. But Sean, this isn't your classic problem, right? How do you... Managing individual instances is very important, right? We've heard that from all of you. I don't think anybody would disagree. How do you do that at a scale of IoT? Yeah, exactly.
Pray. That'll be my answer for almost everything today. No, I think Stan and Rob bring up some great points. There's a couple things. I think CDM was a brilliant idea by DHS to put down a centralized vehicle that brought in capabilities to help primarily the have-nots, but to help the federal government as a whole be uniform. I think CDM also created opportunities for our industry partners in the sense that we're going to have a massive amount of data. It has to be cleaned up. Through the years, we have named everything with no real naming conventions. And so when we get back the first set of reports from CDM asset, as far as hardware and software and vulnerabilities, there is a massive effort that's going to need to be taken to clean up all that data. And that's not going to be easy, and it's going to be very resource intensive. And I've already said that we're already struggling. And so Internet of Things just adds on to that. Individual instances, having a virtualized environment is a potential solution for that. Segmenting it off also is one, putting in its own capsule, its own VLAN to make sure that those things don't touch the rest of the network. But there is no easy solution to this, and it's not going to stop because users are always going to want the next greatest thing. What we have to figure out, and I'll go back to just business, is that we have to have those hard conversations. What is really the business problem that we're trying to solve with this Internet of Things, with this new device, with this new research equipment? What is it that, and what do we already have in the environment? That's what CDM is going to help with. CDM is going to tell us what's out there. Once we clean it up and figure out what everything means and what the naming conventions are, then we can actually have some conversations and say, well, region X is already doing this with this. Why can't you use it? But in other agencies, I found, yeah, but we like this one versus this one. Why? We just like their interface better. And so agencies have to take a hard stance saying, I understand that this doctor likes this one better, but guess what? We've already approved this in the environment. So we either have to make a financial decision to replace them all and go across the agency with one, or you accept the one that's already there. And that's a very, very hard conversation.
Yeah. To your earlier point, though, about cleaning up all that dirty data that you're getting back from your analysis of your networks and your sensors, are you, when some of those things are confusing, you're saying we don't really know exactly what this is or what the threat levels is, are you just segmenting those things off until you can get to them later?
That takes a level of capability that right now we have to really focus on where do we shift the resources. Okay. We are going to see some increase in resources next year, but CDM had some unplanned costs that we didn't program for, so we have to make sure those are happening. We already had some projects in flight, so we have to see, it's a best effort approach. Where do you put the resources? What's going to have the biggest bang for the dollar? There's some things that, what we end up trying to do is too much in government is focus on the technology. It's people, process, technology for a reason. The people in the process are the first key. And we always kind of levitate to technology because we think everybody, honestly, people come in and say we have the technology or the software product that's going to change your world. I think we're starting to get a little better as industry and government of not saying, yeah, that's not necessarily true. Let's figure out how we do this.
Let me hop in just for a second.
Sure.
We can't treat IoT devices like they're people. There's an inherent tendency to treat this new shiny device as something, or old, not so shiny device, as if it has needs and we're worried about the user experience. Back to we don't want to be the chief no officers. I think that they have a finite function. When we understand what the function is, we actually have the ability to mitigate exactly what you're saying, where we can contain and control.
There were two very large global corporations that were drastically affected by the latest ransomware outbreak in the last 2-3 weeks or so. One was a large shipping organization, one was a large pharmaceutical organization, and they're both taking this really as a learning exercise. So we were talking about where you need to focus at, what needs to be online. For the pharmaceutical organization, their number one priority was get drugs to the people that need them. For the other organization that was a shipping organization, it was that we need to get the ships in port, the ones that we don't have enough supplies for the people to stay out there. So again, identifying your most important things, your most important business processes, and being able to enable those as your business continuity plans. And all those things were absolutely IoT related. So where the ships were at, where the shipping ports were at, and a lot of those things got knocked down by the ransomware. So these are some of the things which they've now used as a learning exercise. And there'll be some use cases that come out, and we can all use and learn from those as well.
Because again, it's hard not to think toasters and refrigerators, but the whole point of IoT is it is everything, right? It's the Internet of everything, not just the Internet of things. Did you want to jump in, Sean? You look like you were.
No, I was good. I was just preparing for the next question.
But Brian, I'm going to stick with you for a second. As we talk about, I'm losing my train of thought here. As Sam was talking about, though, you have a lot of things coming out of the network, right? Cisco is just announcing the new MDM partnership. What about BYOD, right? How much of a concern is other things coming out of your network that you're not expecting, and how do you prepare for those?
So even going back to my days of Symantec, and this is also what Sean was talking about, was identifying ownership. When things are coming in, who actually owns the new business unit, who actually owns this new device, whatever it needs to come in and do. Again, back to ownership, and then I can go back and point to how the business unit needs to invest. And I'll backtrack just a second here. One of the problems that's been in security for the last 30 years is security has always been bolted on at the end. It has not been blueprinted from the beginning. So we can't do that with security here anymore. So going back to the question here, so BYOD. If you're going to enable BYOD in your organization, why are you doing that? Is it better for you not to have social media access from your desktop PCs and your government-issued devices because of that's what your mission is, well, then you create a guest wireless, or you create a wireless access WAN that your employees can use so they can check up on their 16-year-old on Facebook or Instagram. So again, creating the policy and letting the technology follow the policy, I think, is one of the most important things. You can't just open it up. When I worked at Symantec, it was one of the most difficult jobs in the company was to be the CISO of a security company because you had 20,000 people that thought they were smart enough to be the CISO. So the minute you put something in place, you had somebody else that was ready to architect their way around it. And the same thing happens here at Cisco as well. And the last thing I'll say on that comment is we look at how much intellectual property Cisco generates, all the products, solutions, technologies, and about 85% of that is actually generated or housed in RTP in North Carolina. We protect RTP completely differently than we do the rest of Cisco. We make sure that we see other portions of Cisco that are trying to attack RTP, and maybe that's a malicious insider. So our BYOD policies follow different rules based on the type of information and location and what's being trying to be accessed as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, Stan, what if your agency's policy is no BYOD? Now, there's no way, somebody's going to break that rule, right? Somebody's going to get their phone inside, something like that. How do you protect against the unwanted BYOD?
Well, I'm fortunate. I get to use our own technology. So if you don't connect with a trusted asset, you don't connect. So I get to cheat because we can sell the products. But again, it's contained control. I sound like a broken record, but ultimately, if someone wants to connect in, they have a finite number of ingress points, and then if they've been compromised, egress points. So again, if you don't have the authorization to connect, you should not be enabled to connect. Now that's more and more challenging because the portfolio of technology, whether it's IoT or the fact that another phone manufacturer has released their 37th flavor of the year. But ultimately, the challenges remain the same. And BYO is whether you're doing it for cost savings, whether you're doing it to enhance the experience of the end user. I look at this through a virtualization, containerization, simplification mechanism. And you can do anything you want outside of my container. Everything, but anything inside of it, I control the vote. Mm-hmm. So,
and as you were talking about privileges before, those are the device privileges, not user privileges, right? Otherwise, you end up with what Brian was talking about.
But you can marry the two of those together. Okay. You can tie them into your identity and access management if you have one, or at a minimum, a well-managed AD.
All right, moving on to our third topic, data security. Now, Rob, you've got an interesting problem here because you're a global agency, really. NASA works with everybody, and from research to working with the Russians to go up to the ISS and the other people up there as well. You're taking in all kinds of data. I'm sure NASA has their sensors on ISS and on the shuttles and the like, but so do the Russians, so do other countries. How do you manage the security of that data coming in when you know it's a shared network?
Yeah, so going back to your earlier point, NASA is unique as a government agency from the standpoint that our mission does depend on international relationships. Some of the greatest Earth scientists, for instance, are in China, and we have working relationships with them. How many other government agencies embrace those kind of partnerships, right? So there are concerns when we have these type of international relationships and exchange of data, but that's where it becomes absolutely critical to understand how and where is data being introduced into the network, how is that being segmented perhaps from other data sources or other mission-sensitive areas within our agency, and having an architecture that, as well as governance, that really supports those international relationships and making sure that the communications with our international partnerships, the data exchange therein is protected. We also have concerns with ITAR, right? So intellectual property that perhaps we develop in the U.S. and it's important to U.S. economic health, that has to be protected. And that's not unique to NASA. There are many government agencies that have that kind of information, but what often happens is you may have a user working on an ITAR type project that really is oblivious to the U.S. economic concerns, if you will, around sharing that data with a foreign nation. So there is a big training aspect to this, and oftentimes training is that first element of the budget that gets cut during hard times. But if you think of your users often as being your weakest link, especially the ones on the inside, if they're not just at a basic level educated on what does ITAR mean, why do we need to protect this data, why should you not be sharing this with a friendly foreign individual, it all creates a breakdown. And if you have the greatest technology in the world, nothing is going to address that insider weakness concern.
Yeah, maybe we should, from a security standpoint, stop talking about Internet of Things, start talking about Internet of Nouns. Right? Add all that back in. When you're talking about sharing though with other international entities that might not be as trusted as others, are you sharing data? Because that seems like something, you can scrub it, what you're sharing with data. Are you sharing sensors? Are they getting raw data?
It's not necessarily sharing sensors that have technology, again, that is maybe ITAR protected, right? So we do not share that type of sensor technology, and we do have within our agency a very comprehensive review process. It just went through one the other week where one of our scientists thought, hey, it'd be a good idea if I take this new emerging sensor technology and share it with a certain foreign university because they have a shared interest in this particular area. And once we evaluated that particular technology, we had to put a stop on that, and we explained the reason why. That's important to come through with the explanation. And then there was kind of an aha moment, right? So we can't always share that sensor technology. Sometimes it's more so the raw data, right? But there has to be an evaluation process, which kind of goes back to that governance structure that needs to be in place.
And I've been hitting you again and again on this one, but I want to do one more aspect of this, which is when you do have to share sensors, how do you protect your network when you have to share some of that?
It's not perfect. I would venture to say that there is no agency that has perfected, whether it's IoT security or what have you.
Security writ large, nobody's.
Right. And so when you look at being in a federated agency, right, an agency with a federated operating model, it becomes even that much more complex. So, we were forced for a number of reasons to kind of stand this up, and we're starting to see some fruits from it, right, which is that broader collaboration, seeing what maybe works at one of our centers, but another center is maybe weak in that area. So, yes, for us, just by the sheer nature of our mission, we have had to put focus on IoT and very specifically ICS.
Just on the compliance topic, there are approximately 360 standards, regs, and laws globally, across every sector, public, private, et cetera. If you distill them down into their least common denominators, they all want pretty much the same thing: confidentiality, integrity, availability, and one other key item. Oh yeah, the ability to prove that you did what you said you were going to do. So when you take that and you see that the IoT or whatever it may be, regardless of the challenge of regulation keeping up with the technology, the problems still remain the same. Do you want lateral motion? Do you want bots running around? Do you want to? So I think we need to kind of step back to a certain degree and say, what do we already have? And we've touched on this a couple times. What do we already have that can mitigate those risks? Because ultimately, whether you're in healthcare, public sector, it doesn't matter, because those are the folks that I deal with on a daily basis around the world. So.
Oh, great. Yes. Do we have microphones wandering around? Coming over for you. Yeah, we'll get them in the back.
Hi, this is more for Rob and Sean. Are there aspects of compliance in government that you would say actually counter your efforts for cybersecurity? And if so, what aspects would you say?
I guess I'd say it depends. So for me, I tend to think in the realm of risk, right? I think that you can get so overly focused on compliance and trying to get a good grade or a good score or be green or what have you, when really what we need to be focused on is risk, right? Why do we have compliance? Well, it's to manage risk. Well, if you forget that basic principle of how do I manage risk, why do we even have a risk process in place? And it is to identify what are the priorities for our remediation actions, how should we be spending our money, how does a given risk impact my business or my mission? Compliance has its purpose. I get that. We have to report out on it. But if we're going through compliance exercises at the expense of not focusing on risk, then that's a broken model.
I think that, and here's why I'll defend compliance, is 99%. I'll say 100, but I'm sure there's 1% out there that's not true. But regulations, policies, laws, everything exists because someone didn't do something. Something happened. And so there's a baseline of those that are doing it right, and then there's also this group that's not. And so the compliance is meant to try to at least make sure that everybody's doing something. But it puts us in a reactive posture. We're looking at compliance. And I think, what we have to focus on is how do we make sure those that aren't doing this right or aren't doing the right things, like Rob talks about, they are doing the right things, then we can really start to move from a reactive to a proactive posture. So I won't say that compliance is taking away. I'm the first one to beat it and say it's on steroids and it's hurting me and all that. But at the same time, I understand why it exists. And it's there for a reason. And I would say today it's still very much needed. That's only because I want to see a shift to a proactive posture, which is looking at what technologies with these two gentlemen and other folks in the audience are presenting. How do we get our people to the right level of expertise, get our processes mature enough that they can support these technologies, then bring in the right technologies to support all of that together and bring it together. And that's where we want to be. And as long as we stay in a reactive posture, we're always going to react to what already happened. We're not looking ahead to what is going to come.
We'll come to you in just a second, because I just want to follow up. Open this to the whole panel if anybody's got an idea here. Is there such thing, or could there be such thing as proactive compliance?
Sure, that's why I said 1%. Yeah, I mean,
does it exist today?
I think there's folks in the audience, the gentleman on the stage here. I would even imagine there's some CISOs with a level of sophistication in their operations that can almost make some pretty good bets about what's coming down the pike. Sure. But, then you also have to say is why aren't those folks doing what they have to? When you have limited resources, it's hard to say I'm going to do what someone who may have 10 times my budget can do. It's a point where I'm sitting here whining, right? I mean, I'm sitting here saying, well, yeah, I can't do this and I can't do that. But we have to figure out where we need to put our resources and where our money's best spent.
Yes.
So just building on that, NGA talks about ATO in a day. The GSA and the White House have put out this RFI about automating compliance. There's the Open Control project. I'm wondering at both EPA and NASA if there's been some movement or exploration on how do we automate not just the compliance but the risk process, and what the thinking is there.
I know that. So let me go with he probably has a better posture, so let me go first. Automation is the key, right? We want to go there. And that's why I'm such a big advocate for the cloud, because then you get into an environment that is at least standardized and configured properly, okay? And it's a lot easier to automate. You're still going to have, depending on the environment, 40 to at least 10%. No one's going to be completely standardized, configured, and can deploy automation across their entire agency or organization, because there's always the one-offs. There's always the legacy system or something that prevents full-blown automation. We're looking at it. That one of the reasons why I went to EPA was because they were moving, with the Salesforce, and they were moving to the cloud and those things to really get into that environment. Now, that's not without challenges, but we have to move there. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, our adversaries are automated. Okay, they can buy a $60 kit with instructions. They push change a couple of characters and push a button, and they're gone. we're still fighting it manually. We're doing, I was talking to a colleague last night that I went to grad school with, and he told me he's still patching with CDs. I was like, oof. I don't even have CD drives on most of my computers nowadays. So, we're just in a posture across that we have the haves and have-nots.
So programs like CDM, right, where you have continuous monitoring of various security controls and systems, that takes us a step closer. When you're dealing with an agency like NASA, though, where you have incredibly complex environments, we build one-off billion-dollar systems that we fly into space, and then they operate sometimes up to 20 years, right? So I think you have to take into perspective the level of complexity of a given agency, right? And is automation possible in some of these very complex environments where you're writing custom code, you're building custom hardware? I'd say it's a difficult challenge. But for our corporate systems and our traditional institutional capability needs, right? I think automation is absolutely possible.
I will echo what you just said there, Rob, about the length of an IoT device, and I think we've circled around this a couple of times. I've got customers along the likes of JCI and Rockwell that make building long contracts for 50 years. So regardless of the technology, which is obviously going to rotate, but they're doing the LEED certification of managing that building. We know what happens with HVAC systems that are not protected, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just NASA that you physically can't go touch it because it's circling around with the nuclear reactor for 20 years. It might be contractually obligated in the operating system of a building, those type of things. It is literally all over the place. And you look at some of the cars. I'm a gearhead, so I've got a couple of classic cars, and I look at some of the technology that's out there. Well, if Toyota or GM starts making IoT type of devices, guess what? We're talking about cars lasting longer times. So these are the type of things. How are you going to patch a 2016 Lexus or 2017 Lexus 20 years from now to make sure that it doesn't turn into a weapon, and when it approaches 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the brakes turn off, so the car accelerates and turns left based on a GPS signal? These are the type of things that, again, IoT has not figured out how to solve yet.
Well, the other thing, too, that was mentioned is the one-offs. Going to space, yeah, I imagine there's a few one-offs. But, as an industry as a whole, we still take COTS products and customize the heck out of them. I've seen in cases where a best-of-breed COTS solution was customized to such a degree that when it was tried to deploy it into the environment, it was sunk cost. It wasn't deployable. And so we have to think about that, too. I was in conversation about priv management for CDM Phase 2, and we were talking about, hey, our posture is a little bit higher than what CDM Phase 2 is. Should we accept, or should we go with a standardized solution that we grow as industry together? Those are hard discussions because you have to decide, okay, I'm going to actually lower my posture for a short term, but long term, this might be the better solution because we grow with the rest of the federal government, and we're not continuing to be a one-off solution that has to worry about the integration solution we put in place, and what is that going to do to further deployments and delays. And those are the kind of conversations that we as CISOs need to start having because our CIOs are already having it, and we need to bring those options to the table. We talked about that with Steve Fine. I think he's very appreciative of bringing those different scenarios to the table when we did yesterday, but those are conversations we have to have, and as CISOs, we have to bring those.
All right, and we actually are running out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up here. If any of you have ever seen me moderate a panel, I always like to end with the news. So we've asked everybody up here to just bring us a little news nugget to wrap up with. We've got about 4 minutes left, so 30 seconds apiece? Or, I'm sorry, a minute apiece? We're going to have a count here. Starting with you, Stan, what do you got to share?
So I've been in the security market for about 30 years, and I would submit, regardless of the age or the newness of any technology, we are finally at a point, in my opinion, where we have the ability to establish enough visibility, then control, then oversight that we never had in my entire career. The saturation of data can now be contained and controlled far better than I've ever seen, and we have technologies that can actually solve the root cause as opposed to that noisy piece of equipment in the corner that goes ping and does me no good except tell me I have yet another problem. So it's a pretty exciting time from a security perspective.
Right.
So I'm going to touch on the topic of security metrics, and I'm going to say this because it's my news. It may not be everybody's news, but we just prepared this inside of Cisco. We provide two statistics to the board of directors of Cisco every month, and that is time to detect and time to contain. Notice I didn't say time to mitigate, because sometimes you want a threat to go ahead and execute for a while so I can gain intelligence and hand it over to US or somebody that's in the prosecution or attribution business. But one of the most difficult things to do in security is prove that it's working. And the instant that it's not working, well, guess what? Then you have a RGE or a resume generating event. But if you have something that you can do to actually show how security is putting points on the board, how you're measuring security, and be able to explain that, not just show them your math, but explain that to the people that stroke checks, whether it be your organization's finance organization, procurement, things of that nature. Being able to show your work, show your explanation, and make it in layman's terms, that's what is, in my eyes, one of the most important things we need to keep our eyes on. And that's one of the things we've started doing inside of Cisco, actually quite a while ago.
John.
I'll take a little bit from both of them, and something we talked about earlier is I think the CISO community needs to continue to evolve. 10 to 15 years ago, the CIO community, we were told we had to come out as being a CIO and a deputy CIO at VA. But years ago, we were told we need to come out from the help desk, we need to come out from the back shop and really start to engage with our business customers. And now it's time, and I think we're seeing it. Our CISOs are doing the same. We've even played within our shop of creating a chief security technology officer, someone that's focused on the technology, because the CISO really needs to be talking to the CIO and how to enable their vision and mission, but also to how do we help our business customers, and we talk about that business enablement. And that's really where the next step of this goes, because if we can't contribute to enabling the business and helping them understand our security and what we need to do, then we're not much value and we're not going to be respected as we come to those kind of conversations.
Rob.
So I'll touch on the cybersecurity executive order. I mentioned earlier that for NASA, our mission depends on some of our international relationships. One of the tenets of the cybersecurity executive order was strengthening our international relationships and identifying opportunities, right, to learn from those international relationships. There are, national partners, international partners that have shared interests, that have shared mission alignment, and the more that we can leverage that and learn from each other, if a major attack hits across the pond, we're sharing that well, we're learning from it, the indicators of compromise are disseminated well, that's going to help us, right? So I'm certainly excited about the outcomes of the cybersecurity executive order. One last plug, Eclipse 2017.nasa.gov, August 21st, Total Solar Eclipse. We have a website dedicated to that event. Please go and check it out if you have an interest.
And while we're
People here in DC?
Not a prime viewing zone. Yeah.
But you can watch it on NASA's site. Yeah. And while we're plugging things, I've got to give two quick ones, or my marketing department would kill me. We've got Federal Times covering all federal operations, IT, acquisition management, and the like. We actually have some advanced copies of the next issue of the magazine in back, so feel free to grab an issue. And then Fifth Domain, which is my other brand that we just launched that back in January, covering all things cybersecurity from a civilian side, defense, international, and the like. Gentlemen, please, everybody, please help me thank Robert Powell, Sean Kelly, Brian Tillett, and Stan Black. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for the discussion and for keeping the momentum going. The chapter has also donated a small donation on behalf of the speaker.